Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. If you've watched the channel for a while, you might have seen my review of the Darkvoice 336 SE amplifier. That was some time ago now, but I wasn't overly impressed with what I heard. The Darkvoice is an OTL tube amplifier, and I'll explain what that means later, but the reason I mention that is because so is the xDuoo TA-26 here. This has been kindly sent to me by Apos Audio for review, and I was very interested to see if it had the same kind of overly mushy, smooth sound out of the box as the Darkvoice, or whether it provided a better, immediate experience without having to spend money and time finding the right tubes. So come with me now as we explore the xDuoo TA-26. The TA-26 here retails for $319 US, which places it a bit higher than some of the other xDuoo amps that I reviewed, like the MT601, 602 and 604, but it's also quite a different design. The MT6 series amps are hybrid amps, meaning they've got a tube and an output transistor or op-amp in order to produce the audio. In the case of the TA-26 here though, it's all tube. I mentioned at the beginning, it's an OTL amp, which means output transformerless. And what that means is that you've got two tubes doing the work of doing the amplification, and there's nothing other than maybe a capacitor or two between your headphones and the tubes themselves. OTL amps have their pros and cons. An OTL amp is going to give you the most tubey sound, whatever that's going to mean to you, and I'll talk soon about the fact that tubes shouldn't always be considered rich and warm. This is definitely a good example of that, but it is going to give you the most transparent access to the sound of the tubes. And that's because there's less between your headphones and the tubes themselves. On the other hand, one of the drawbacks of OTL designs is that without the transformer, the output impedance of the headphone amp goes much higher. And I'm going to talk more about that soon, but basically what that means is that a tube amp like this, an OTL tube amp like this, is really only suited for high impedance headphones and some planar magnetic cans. You might have heard otherwise about planar magnetics. I'll cover that shortly. For now though, let me introduce exactly what the TA-26 is, and we'll get into some of those details shortly. As you can see on the front panel here, we've got a power switch, we've got a headphone socket, and we've got a volume control. So it's all pretty simple. We've got a pair of tubes. This one is your input tube. This does the initial application of gain, and this is the output tube, which is essentially the one driving your headphones. Under this big chunk of metal here, that's a power transformer. And then on the back, we've got a simple IEC input socket and two pairs of RCA sockets. One pair is for your incoming audio, the other pair is for preamp output. So yes, this can run as a tube preamplifier should you want it to. I haven't been set up to test that specifically, but what I can tell you is you're going to get very similar performance from the preamp output as you get from the headphone socket, as I'm going to describe. One thing to keep in mind is that sometimes tube amps like this running as preamps have issues with hum and noise and ground loops, so do take that into account. It's not going to be specific to the individual model, it's going to depend on the speakers that you're driving and your overall source chain. So in other words, there's no point me testing this one and telling you if I got those sorts of noises, because that could be dependent on my setup and it won't necessarily translate to your setup. So I haven't tested that, but I'm going to tell you all about the sound from headphones. I'm going to tell you about the sound with some different tubes. I'm going to go through as much as I can to give you a full picture of the TA-26. And let's start that journey off with a conversation about the tubes. The TA-26 comes with a set of tubes consisting of a 6N8P tube at the front and a 6N5P at the back. So again, that's the input tube and the output tube. The front 6N8P is the equivalent to a 6SN7 tube, and the 6N5P at the back is equivalent to a 6080 or a 6AS7 tube. Now if you're wondering what all these different numbers flying around and letters flying around are, all the different tubes, depending on where they're manufactured, are given different codes. And so part of the challenge if you're trying to roll tubes in an amplifier like this is working out which tubes will work and which tubes won't work. So while 6N8P is the Chinese variant of this front input tube, if you're looking at European tubes, it's going to be a 6SN7. I believe 6SN7 will also translate to tubes made in the UK and also in America. In the case of the 6N5P, things are basically the same again. 6N5P is the Chinese variant, and then 6080 or 6AS7 are different versions made elsewhere in the world. To make things even trickier, you may find some different Russian tubes as well with different classification codes again. The key is if you find a tube which is compatible with a 6N8P or 6SN7, it should work in the front socket. And if you find a tube that's compatible with a 6N5P, a 6080 or a 6AS7, then you should be just fine for the back socket. I'll talk through some tube rolling shortly, but I just wanted to cover off those are the tubes in use. Now because this is generally a pretty simple amplifier in the sense that other than having tubes, you just switch it on, you plug in your headphones and you go, there's not really a lot more to talk about. But I do want to take a few minutes to talk about the output impedance. I touched on this before, because you're directly driving your headphones from the tubes, the output impedance of this is quite high. If you look at the output impedance of most solid state amps on the market, it's going to be under 1 ohm. The idea of having a low output impedance is that the amplifier is able to drive any sort of load with pretty good efficiency. So whether it's a pair of 16 ohm IEMs or a pair of 300 ohm ZMF headphones, you're going to get fairly consistent performance. In the case of the OTL tube amps though, as I've already mentioned, they have much higher output impedance. I measured this one and it roughly came out at about 90 ohms. A 90 ohm output impedance isn't the highest I've ever seen, but it's high enough that it is going to limit the dynamic driver headphones that you're going to want to pair up with a TA-26. The general rule of thumb is that you want a headphone impedance that's about 8 times the impedance of the output of the amplifier. In this case, that's pretty unachievable. That would mean we needed a 720 ohm headphone, but the reason for that rule of thumb is it's more about the distance between the output impedance and the headphone impedance, not a specific number that you absolutely have to achieve. And there are a few reasons for that, and that's where the question of which headphones will pair well with this gets a little bit complex. The first and most obvious issue is going to come down to frequency response. One of the problems with a high output impedance is that when you connect up a headphone with lower impedance, so something that is closer to or even below the output impedance of the amplifier, then what happens is the amplifier gets very inefficient at delivering its power. If you're using dynamic driver headphones, most of those will have variable impedance depending on the frequency you're delivering to them. In other words, it might be easier to deliver a tone at 50 Hz, it might get harder at 80 Hz, easier again at 100 Hz, and easier all the way up into the treble. For example, that's not consistent. It depends a lot on the natural resonance of the driver being used, and the key point is they're all different. What that means for us when we're listening is that depending on which frequencies are harder or easier to drive into that dynamic driver, that's going to change the frequency response. So if you have a headphone that is harder to drive at say 80 Hz and it's not a good impedance match with a TA-26, what you're going to find is that there's a bit of a hole, a bit of a suck out at 80 Hz. Because the impedance mismatch means that the TA-26 or whatever the amplifier is having more difficulty and therefore delivering less power at that particular frequency. And therefore you're going to alter the frequency response of the dynamic driver headphone depending on where it's most difficult to drive. Now in case none of this is making sense, let me summarize it and show you some examples on screen. I tested a handful of headphones running first of all from the Hugo TT2, which has got a sub 1 ohm output impedance, and then I tested the exact same headphones running at the same approximate volume. I've matched it up as best I can within the software and measured them running from the TA-26. What you'll notice as I go through these examples is that some of the headphones varied significantly in their frequency response between the TT2 and the TA-26, whereas others stayed more consistent. And that's, as I said before, where things get tricky. One headphone that might have low impedance might also have a fairly flat impedance curve regardless of frequency, and therefore it's not going to be particularly affected by the TA-26 output. Another headphone though might have a fairly significant peak in its impedance, and that's going to then show more of a frequency response variation. One thing that you can predict consistently is that the higher the impedance gets, so when we start getting to 120 ohm and 300 ohm headphones, the higher the impedance gets, the further away it gets from the 90 ohm output of the TA-26, TA-26, the less impact the TA-26 is going to have on the frequency response of the headphone. And so ultimately we end up with two factors to consider. Sometimes the variations made by an amplifier like this are actually preferable. Even if it's changing the frequency response, that's not necessarily bad if you enjoy the sound more afterwards. So some lower impedance headphones can sound great from an OTL amp. And then the other thing to consider is that if you want to make sure you're getting consistent performance, stick with a higher impedance headphone like, as I said before, a 300 ohm Sennheiser, ZMF, Bayer Dynamic, etc. So other than a high output impedance potentially affecting the frequency response of dynamic driver headphones, they don't have that impact on planar magnetic headphones because planar magnetic headphones have dead flat impedance curves. The other issues you need to take into account is that the high output impedance means that this amp is going to be very inefficient at delivering power to lower impedance headphones. And what that means is that if you do try to run planar magnetics that are less sensitive and lower impedance, you're likely to hear distortion and a general lack of power. And that's purely because the amplifier just can't overcome the inefficiency of the gap between, say, 90 ohm output and a 30 ohm headphone load. The final thing to take into account is that a higher output impedance also means the amp has less overall control over the driver. That's a thing called damping factor. So an amplifier is responsible for pushing the headphone driver, but also stopping it when it needs to. In the case of dynamic drivers in particular, they want to wobble a little bit because of the way they're designed, and so the amplifier's job is to stop that wobble and keep the driver well under control. If you have a lower impedance headphone with a higher impedance amp, what you're going to find is it's less able to control that wobble. The end result will generally be a headphone sounding a bit looser, a little bit fuller in the bass, not quite as tight and well controlled. And again, that can sometimes be positive, it can sometimes be negative. It's not going to turn any headphone into this flabby monster, but it can lead to a little bit more sense of fullness and a slightly less sense of attack and clarity sometimes, which can be good if you've got something bright. It might be bad if you've already got a warm headphone. Now, in all of my reading and research over the years, and also my testing and listening, I don't believe this impact happens to the same degree on planar magnetics. It may happen a little bit, but not very much. And so really you need to think about all of what I've said here, mostly in relation to dynamic driver headphones. If you're running planars, the only real problem running planars off an amp like this is going to be a lack of power because of the inefficiency driving from a 90 ohm output into, say, a 30 ohm load. So I've kind of flown through the issues with high output impedance. Hopefully it all makes sense. It's probably a good time to mention that if you want to know more about this, I'm currently building a course. I've shared a few posts about it on my community page here on YouTube. But if you do want to know more, if you want to understand how all this works and what it means for you as a listener, then do keep an eye out on the community page. Keep an eye out on the upcoming videos. I'll announce it formally here in the near future. But I'm hoping somewhere around March 2022 to have my course available to launch to you. So if you want to know more, if you want to learn more, do hit the subscribe button and the notification bell because I hope to have that coming soon. But for now, let's carry on with the sound quality of the TA-26. I did most of my testing with the TA-26 using the Sennheiser and Drop HD6XX. Not because it's a top-of-the-line headphone, but because it's a great match being a fairly affordable 300 ohm headphone, pairing it up with an OTL amp with a 90 ohm output impedance. What I heard straight out of the box with the TA-26, plugging in the HD6XX, and what I mean by straight out of the box is using the stock tubes. What I heard was a sound that's got a nice sense of richness in the bass, not overly warm, not boosted at all, but it's certainly got a good sense of smooth, rich and present bass, but also a good sense of clarity up top. Unlike the Darkvoice 336 SE which I reviewed, when it came straight out of the box, I felt like things were muddy and thick. This is not the case with the TA-26. The moment you plug this in and fire it up with something like the HD6XX, you're going to get vocals that have got beautiful tonal character. They've got a little tiny bit of richness and weight to them, but they're not over enhanced. The sound is fairly intimate. I wouldn't go so far as saying it's congested, but it's not the most spacious sound I've heard. And that is where some tube rolling can help. We'll get to tube rolling in a moment. But if I had to level any criticism against the TA-26 in its stock form, it would be that it is a little bit intimate sounding. Not overly spacious, but also not overly congested, just somewhere in that kind of mediocre world in between. The treble from this amp has a good sense of attack, and it can actually get sibilant on really hot tracks, and I say that as a positive. This is not an amp that's going to roll everything off, smooth over all the details, and make everything sound mushy. and that is where I found the 336 SE a bit borderline at times, in its stock form. The TA-26 though, straight out of the box, has a much cleaner, more neutral sound despite being an OTL amp. It's not neutral in the sense of a super clean solid state, but it's definitely not a thick, rich, tubey sound. And so clearly, as I've already said, straight out of the box, this was much more fun for me than a Darkvoice 336 SE. Because I haven't got the 336 SE here anymore, and really I don't have any other pure tube amps in the same class as something like this. And so I thought what I might do is give you a good reference point using what I know to be a very neutral amp and comparing it to the TA-26 purely to give you a sense of the tonality in its stock form. And so what I did was I used the HD6XX as a headphone, and I played the same track through both the Hugo TT2, that was my neutral reference point, and then using the TT2 as the DAC, I ran that into the TA-26 and listened to the same track with this as the amplifier. The track I was using was Time Tough by Toots and the Maytals, and what I heard as I compared the two was that, as you'd expect, the TT2 was delivering a greater sense of micro details and those finer nuances that you'd expect from a top-of-the-line solid-state amplifier. What I was more interested in for this review though was the general tonality, and going from the TT2 over to the TA-26, what I heard were vocals that were only just a little tiny bit richer and warmer sounding than the TT2. The general sound from the TA-26 is just a little bit more laid back. It's not, as I said before, slow and mushy, it just takes a little bit of the edge off the overall sound. So as I said, vocals are a little bit richer, the bass from the TA-26 is a tiny bit slower and maybe just a tiny bit fuller, but we're talking small shifts here. We're talking a 5 to 10% change. We're not talking drastic shifts. From the TA-26, the treble is definitely smoother overall. It's not lacking entirely, but you can hear a greater sense of attack from the TT2, again as you'd expect. And what that means is things like there's a tambourine in Time Tough that's off on the left of the soundstage, and that particular tambourine sound, when you switch between the two amplifiers, it's definitely more present and more forward from the TT2, whereas it does get just a little bit less defined and a little bit less present from the TA-26. It doesn't lose its character entirely, it doesn't get lost in the mix on the TA-26, it's just not as present. And so what really impressed me from that comparison was that this is a tube amp that gives you a bit of tube character without overwhelming you with richness, warmth, smoothness, some of those things that a lot of people consider to be tube sound. This is what I consider a good example of a tube amplifier that doesn't push things too far. It's not extreme, it's just giving you that little bit of tubey magic that you can't get from most solid state amps. The other thing that really stood out to me from this comparison with the TT2 was that the TA-26 is able to get most of the performance out of the HD6XX. And that's why I say it's a really good pairing between this and the HD6XX, because you've got a mid-tier type headphone with a mid-tier type amp, and they're working together really well in synergy. Pairing the HD6XX up with something like a TT2 is a little bit silly in some ways, because you're never going to get the most of the TT2 from a headphone like the HD6XX, whereas the 6XX and the TA-26 is kind of a match made in heaven. So for me, at this point, I would definitely recommend the xDuoo TA-26, and that would be a recommendation for anybody running a headphone that's got at least, say, 120, 150 ohms or above. Ideally, you'd be pairing this with things like an HD6XX or a 650 or a 600, a Beyerdynamic with 250 ohms or higher impedance, or a ZMF headphone with 300 ohm impedance. They're the best options off the top of my head. Also, there'd be the Audio-Technica R70X. They would work quite well with this. Anything that's got a high impedance to start with. If you are looking at lower impedance headphones, it's important to note that it may or may not improve the sound from those. Sometimes it's beneficial to change the frequency response, sometimes it's not, and it's very hard to know exactly what it's going to do unless you get right into the graphs and can find information about the impedance characteristics of the headphone. Otherwise, it's very difficult to predict, and it kind of comes down to a luck of the draw. So if you're running high impedance headphones or planning to, and you're looking for a great OTL tube-based amplifier, then the TA-26 is a fantastic choice. But if you're going to choose a TA-26, you might want to know about some tube options to roll through the output and input sockets. So let's now dive into just a couple of really quick examples. I haven't gone too exotic here, I've kept things pretty straightforward. What I've got here on my desk now is a bunch of different tubes that I bought to try rolling through the TA-26. And I deliberately didn't spend too much money, partly because I can't afford to spend so much money on everything I review, but also because I didn't want to go crazy when A, we've got an amplifier amplifier that only costs a few $100 to start with, and B, when it's really more about finding what sounds good rather than trying to search out the holy grail. Spending a huge amount on NOS tubes or new old stock tubes is a little bit of a fool's errand in my opinion. There are a few tubes out there that really do sound great, but as you'll hear me talk about in a second, often the new production tubes at this sort of level of amplifier are just as good. And so let me talk you through what I tried. I don't have pricing for all these because in a lot of cases they're going to depend on the availability, who's listing them on eBay, that sort of thing. But in the case of the new old stock tubes, I didn't spend over $100 on anything. And in the case of the new production tubes, the same is true where I spent around about $60 to $70 maximum on any of these tubes. And that's all Australian dollars. So we're probably talking $75 to $80 max on any of these tubes. The first tube I tried was in the input socket and it was a Tungsol 6SN7 tube. Technically it's a 6SN7 GTB and it looks exactly the same as the stock tube that was in there. Now actually technically this tube that's in there here is not the stock tube, but they look almost identical. The Tungsol here is a new production tube and it's a pretty cheap one. Probably around 30 Australian dollars, maybe 40 Australian dollars, so not at all expensive. Comparing it to the stock 6N8P input tube, the sound that I got from the Tungsol was a little bit more spacious overall, and it was also for me just a little bit richer through the mid-range, and yet at the same time came across with a slightly greater sense of articulation and clarity through the mids. So all in all, for a very affordable new production tube, I felt like it was a little bit of an upgrade over the stock tube in the TA-26. And keep in mind, the stock tubes from this were completely fine. If you never chose to roll tubes, you're still going to have a great experience with the TA-26 in my opinion, but it's nice to see that just a very small investment in an input tube, nothing else was changed, just that brought a little bit of extra performance from the TA-26. So from the Tungsol, my next question was what happens if I go to something like an Electro Harmonics with the gold pins. So this one is a 6SN7EH, which is the Electro Harmonics gold pin version, and that's what I've left installed here in the video that you're seeing. The reason for that is that this was easily my favourite sound. With the Electro Harmonics installed, keeping in mind that the Tungsol was already an upgrade over the stock tube, the Electro Harmonics brought more upgrade again. Compared to the Tungsol, the sound from the Electro Harmonics gold pin was a little bit cleaner and more articulate, but without losing any sense of weight or clarity, just making things a little bit cleaner and crisper sounding. Nothing harsh, nothing cold or neutral or lean, just a nice sense of clarity, cleanliness and dynamics overall. I also felt like maybe the Electro Harmonics was pushing the soundstage out just a tiny bit more, but this was hard to know for sure because there's obviously the time required to switch off the amp, let the tubes cool, swap the tubes, plug the new one back in, warm it back up again, so there's not a particularly quick turnaround there. So anything that's subtle, and this was only a subtle difference, I'm not going to guarantee that it's necessarily bigger, but it did feel like it was a slightly larger soundstage with a slightly better sense of space. Ultimately for me though, I felt like the Electro Harmonics tube was like the Tungsol done just a little bit better. And so those were the only input tubes I tried, and as you already know, I landed on the Electro Harmonics, and then I started playing with the output tubes. The first output tube I tried was again a simple new production, in this case Sovtek tube, and it was a Sovtek 6AS7 equivalent, which is actually a 6H5C. So remember before I said that there'd be some Russian tubes with different classifications again, this is one of them. The sound going from the stock tube in the TA-26 to the Sovtek brought a sense of punchy, full of bass, and I mean that in a good way. It was tight, punchy bass. It just improved the bass quality and quantity a little bit. I felt like the top end sound, so the treble frequencies, also got a little bit smoother in the sense that it was more refined, but it didn't get rolled off or anything like that. It was still present, it was still clear, it was just more refined and a little bit smoother. Thanks to the additional clarity of the Electro Harmonics input tube, I actually felt like the combination of the Sovtek and the Electro Harmonics made a really nice synergy together. And indeed, this is the tube that has stayed with me in the TA-26 ever since. So in other words, we've got two relatively affordable new production tubes. You don't have to go out and buy fancy NOS tubes to get a really nice sound from the TA-26. But at the time of my testing, I didn't know this was going to be where I finished, and so I carried on through a series of NOS tubes. The next tube I tried was a NOS tongue sole tube, which is in this box here, and this is classed as a 6336A. As you might be able to tell as I'm just holding it here, it's a shorter tube than the stock 6N5P, and so it does sit a little bit lower in the amplifier, but it works just fine. What I heard from this tube is a staging that is much more forward, and honestly it got a bit claustrophobic. I wasn't a huge fan of this tube in this amplifier. I also felt like the mid-range got a little bit overemphasized, and so it was a pretty short-lived test with the 6336A. So from there, I moved on to a 6080 or a 6AS7 tube, and in this case, it was a Hewlett-Packard tube, which is actually made by RCA, but made for Hewlett-Packard. This is again a NOS tube, so it comes in the wonderful old box with the old paper wrapping. And as you'll see as I hold this one, it's clearly a much shorter tube. So when this one's installed inside the TA-26, it kind of reminds me of R2-D2 riding in an X-Wing. All you see is kind of the little silver dome on top. It's sort of cute, it sort of looks a bit dinky. In the end for me, what matters is how it sounds, but it's not the best looking tube perhaps when you put it in the TA-26. What I heard from it though was a very neutral clean sound. This is a lovely clean sounding tube. But in the case of the TA-26, particularly with the very nice clean Electro-Harmonix input tube, it was all just a little bit too sterile for my tastes. Comparatively, this lacks the richness that I was enjoying from the Sovtek tube, and so whilst if you had a pair of headphones that were a warmer, thicker, richer sound, this might be good. For me, I probably prefer the Sovtek, both because it looks a bit better, but more importantly, because it sounds better for me. So the 6080 RCA made for Hewlett-Packard is a nice match if you want a very clean and neutral sounding tube. If you had a more thick and rich input tube, this would probably be a really good choice. But for me, it wasn't quite as enjoyable and lacked a little bit of the euphonic nature of the tongue sole tube in the TA-26. So great if you're looking for lean and neutral and clean, but not so good if you want a bit of tubey magic. So putting away the HP tube, my final stop was with another 6080 tube. This time it was a Philips NOS tube. This is also a 6080, it's the 6080 WC, I'm not sure what the WC stands for, but it's once again a shorter tube. And so again, this was an R2-D2 effect, where it's sitting quite low in the chassis, and I found this one to be a lovely tube for vocals. It brought the mids forward in a really positive way. It engaged me more in the vocals than something like the Sovtek tube, and it also has a little bit more clarity than the Sovtek tube, but without getting harsh. So it's a really nice refined quality tube, both for mid-range and treble quality. Overall, I found it to be quite a euphonic tube. It was very enjoyable, it has a sense of richness and magic to it, but it doesn't get thick or muddy at all. In some ways, it's almost like the opposite of the HP tube I just tried, in the sense that if the Sovtek setting dead center, then the HP tube went a little bit too cool and clean for me, whereas this one goes a little bit more towards euphonics, and that can be preferable or it could take it too far. For me, it becomes really difficult to separate this NOS Philips tube from the Sovtek tube. I really like both of them. As you can see, I stuck with the Sovtek tube as kind of a middle of the road, and also because it's a new production tube, I didn't really want to burn up hours on a nice quality NOS tube when I'm just tooling around with it, and so I'll probably list this one on eBay or sell it to a patron who's playing with tubes to give this one a try. That said, it's a lovely tube. I might also choose to hang on to it for the days that I feel like a bit of tubey magic. And so to bring all this to a conclusion, there's a couple of things that I wanted to kind of wrap up with. First and foremost, it's the fact that my chosen tube combination is what I found preferable with my source chain and a pair of 6XXs. That doesn't mean it's going to be the best option for you, but it might give you some sense of the sorts of directions you might want to head. I can't stress enough, don't waste a fortune of money buying NOS tubes when there are some really nice new production tubes around, and I think new production tubes are a really good way of getting a sense of what tonality you're looking for. You can then go hunting for a NOS tube that exactly targets the tonality that you're enjoying. For my system, I've landed on a couple of new production tubes, but again, I'd also be very happy with the NOS Philips tube, and that wasn't expensive either. So don't go crazy with tubes, enjoy the process, enjoy rolling through them, but please don't spend a fortune. You're better off, if you're going to spend a fortune on tubes, you're better off actually selling off this amp, buying a higher level amp with the money you would have spent on tubes, because that's going to give you the greater performance. Overall though, I want to round out this review by saying that I think the TA-26 is a brilliant example of a pre-made, ready to go OTL amplifier. Unfortunately, I don't have a bottle head crack here anymore, which is a DIY kit equivalent to this, in the sense that once it's built, it delivers a beautiful OTL amplifier just like this, but in a bit of a different form factor. I would have loved to compare the two. But for now, if you're not interested in building your own, I do think the TA-26 is very hard to go past. I personally think it's better than the 336 SE straight out of the box. You don't have to go hunting for the right set of tubes to offset the inbuilt tonality within the circuit. So the TA-26 for me is an easy recommendation for anybody looking to spend around about $300 on a quality tube amp in the OTL version. I still also think the xDuoo MT604, 602 and 601 are great, so it kind of depends on what you're after, and I'd recommend checking out my roundup of the MT6 series amps if you're not sure which way to go. For now though, I hope you found this review useful. If you have, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe, like, ring the notification bell, and let YouTube know that you want to see more reviews like this from me. But in the meantime, I'll leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.